From the Battery Street studios of KCBS Radio in San Francisco, I'm Matt Pitman, and this is Bay Current for Thursday, December 9th. Yesterday, in Redwood City, at the San Mateo Courthouse, 17 years after he was found guilty of murdering his wife, Lacy, 8 months pregnant at the time, with their soon-to-be son, Connor, Scott Peterson was sentenced to life in prison. This was the much-anticipated resentencing after a 2020 California State Supreme Court decision overturned the death penalty he was assessed in 2004 at the end of his long criminal trial. I was there, inside the courtroom, along with only 2 other journalists. And this is what we saw. Only 3 members of the media were originally selected as part of a lottery of all of the media who asked to be credentialed or would be here representing their various stations and affiliations. Only 3 of us were allowed in. I was one of them, and my guest was another one of them, Laura Anthony from ABC 7, who's a very familiar face and name. You've been in the Bay Area for...
I've been in the Bay Area for the better part of closer to 25 years.
Okay, wow.
Been at KGO since 2001, and prior to that, Cron.
Okay.
So this case was one of the first big stories I covered once I arrived at KGO. This was the Christmas of 2002.
Right.
And my photographer and I, Randy Davis, were dispatched to Modesto. We happened to be working, I believe it was Christmas Day, when we were sent out to Modesto because this young pregnant woman was missing from her home.
Yeah.
And of course on Christmas Day, as you know, there aren't always a lot of stories. So
right.
That was the one we went and did. And so we arrived outside her house, and at that point there were very few media members there. It hadn't become a big national story yet.
So being inside today, having seen this journey from beginning up to this phase today, you had a chance to reflect on that at all?
Well, as I was sitting there, and you and I were near the front because we did get those lottery tickets. I was actually in the front row. I think I was the closest reporter to him.
You were.
And I couldn't help but think back to that Christmas Day when Randy and I went to Modesto for this story. And of course, the first place you go is the house where she was missing from. And Scott, the husband, came out of the house, and he came right up to me and he said, "Whose cameras are these?" And I said, "Well, I'm San Francisco, ABC 7. This is 2 of them, I think, were from Sacramento because that was kind of where the 2 markets meet."
Sure.
And another one I remember was a producer for Good Morning America. So they were there. And he said, "Well, don't take any pictures of me, my house, or my family." And for the next 10 minutes, and a lot of the early video of him is me standing there talking to him in the street, and he's got this baseball cap and it's kind of pulled down. And I remember standing there trying to explain to him that, you know, Scott, this is one of the few times that I think we can help.
Right.
When there's somebody missing.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're the ones that can get the word out. We're, you know, a big market, San Francisco. It'll get picked up by national media.
Yeah.
And if you really want to help find Lacy, as difficult as it is, this would be the time for you, especially as the husband, to get out there and do as many interviews as you could.
Yeah.
And he politely stood there and listened to me and nodded his head and thanked me. And basically said no. And the one thing he let us do, which I'll never forget, was, you know, the story originally was that Lacy was walking her dog in the park.
Right.
And I asked him if we could get a piece of video, a little bit of video of the dog, because the dog came
Mackenzie,
back.
right?
Mackenzie.
Right.
And he said yes. And that was all we got out of Scott Peterson that first day. And then there were press conferences. His family, Sharon Rocha, who I saw again today for the first time in probably 15 years in person, she was out there with Brent and Amy, the brother and sister. Lacy's father was alive at the time. He was up there emotional, these just heart-wrenching press conferences. And Scott wasn't up there. He was sitting back behind all the reporters with that same baseball cap on and kind of slumped down in the chair. I mean, given what we know now and his conviction, and I know today he was resentenced, even then it struck a lot of us as a bit odd. At the same time, everyone handles things like that in their own way.
And that's been the entire conversation about his behavior, basically leading up to when we learned a little bit more of the things I think he wanted concealed.
Right.
Amber Frey, being, I think, the biggie.
Sure.
But even then, so you just kind of got a sense that this is not, and as you mentioned, everyone does handle things differently. There is no playbook for grief, for shock, for mourning, and things like that. But even that early, you could sense that something was
just off.
Yes,
and he would explain that, and his attorney went over it again today.
They tried again today
that the reason he acted like that, and the reason that he maybe tried to hide his face or wear the cap or stay out of the limelight, was that he knew he was having this inappropriate affair with Amber Frey, and he didn't want that to be exposed, because then, according to his attorney, the focus would be taken off, the search would end for Lacy, and so that it was in her interest that he was not out there. And everyone can, I guess, draw their own conclusions based on what happened during the trial and the evidence came out. I will say what struck me today, because this again is the first time I've seen him in person. I'm sure he didn't remember me, but I was among many of the reporters that were, had his I still have his cell phone number in my phone.
Wow.
He stopped answering calls a long time ago, but just the swagger that he had then, I certainly did not see now.
Right.
And what struck me is he's close to 50 years old. He's a middle-aged man. He's been on death row for 17 years?
Yeah.
Didn't see any swagger today. I saw an orange jumpsuit and a man who looked like he'd been through a lot and has aged and was quite a bit thinner.
Yeah, he was. Anything else stand out in terms of, it's so hard to read facial expressions when half your face is covered up with a face mask, and so that was tough. I think of things like the fact that he did maintain eye contact with the three members of Lacy's family that spoke, her sister, brother, and mother, Sharon.
There was no looking away.
Yeah, there was.
He shook his head a couple times, but it was only in response to the attorneys.
To the DA speaking,
saying some things that maybe he didn't like.
And even then, it was very brief. It
kind of would just shake it subtly. But I did see. I felt, and again, we all had masks on, so it's hard to see. But and I was close enough into the angle where I could see his eyes, and it did look to me like after. Brent talked, the last of the family members, that he started to tear up.
Interesting. I didn't catch that, but I did catch it was Brent who spoke, and Brent started off by making a statement something along the lines of Lacy was a person who was the life of the party. He talked about her gregarious personality that we've come to understand because none of us met Lacy.
Right.
And the only time I saw him react was just a very subtle, very brief head nod. He lowered his eyes and nodded his head just a couple times very quickly, and that was it. Aside from keeping that eye contact, that was the only
and I feel
interaction,
like the eye
I guess.
contact is obviously, something I'm sure he and his attorney discussed, and they wanted to make sure that he was respectful, and if he's maintaining that he loved her and he didn't harm her and all of that, of course he's going to want to sit there and listen intently and respond appropriately.
Yeah.
And I think throughout, his attorney made a couple references to not wanting to disrespect the family of Lacy at all, to respect their grief.
Right.
So I think that was all certainly intentional. I was a little surprised that the judge, I thought he would be able to speak. I thought he might not speak by choice, given the upcoming litigate or future hearings and things. But I was a little surprised that the judge said he couldn't speak. But in any case, I also was surprised that his attorney, spent a lot of time in there and out here, basically trying to relitigate.
Yeah, absolutely. Just reading more things into the record, both the legal record and the public record, because they're clearly not finished. They will definitely appeal, and they might appeal that appeal if it doesn't go their way. We'll deal with that when we get there. Last thing I wanted to ask you was just about Mrs. Roach's statements.
Sure.
Brother and sister did get emotional, and a couple times had to stop. Not Mom. Sharon was, I imagine her writing with, a pen or pencil on paper, and then, maybe going back and typing that up. But every word was designed to make an impact. And she got through it. She didn't have that moment where she broke up or had to pause. And she delivered just... I don't know how you couldn't have feelings listening to a mother speak like that all these years later. And man, going through and ticking off dates, when you were doing 19 years ago today, This one. You know what you did 19 years ago tomorrow? You bought the boat where you dumped my daughter in the bed. And I'm just sitting there getting goosebumps just describing it back to you.
And the part I hadn't heard, like I said, I was there early on, and then but I did not, because just my geographic beat is the East Bay and beyond. When the trial came here to Redwood City, I didn't cover it. I covered the preliminary hearing in Modesto. I had never heard the story about Sharon and her then husband Ron Gransky, who's since passed away. They were over at their house for dinner. And
on the 15th of December.
And I never heard that story where she's saying, you were telling us this and that, and now I know that,
right.
And he's
how was the Altamont Pass? And you chuckled and were like, oh, it was okay. And now I know you never went.
And just that was chilling. And I'm sure she's running that night over in her head. She still is. I will say, I think watching her, I think she's on a mission, and it's to bring justice for her daughter and for Connor. And so whatever breaking down she wanted to do, she probably did before and after. Yeah. But in that moment, she was going to look at him. And I mean, what I heard, more so than from the brother and the sister, was anger.
Oh, for sure.
Just anger.
Yeah. And that was, I think, the biggest kind of question that I had was, what would the different spectrums of emotions be? Grief, sadness, and anger, all these years later. And as her brother and sister said, that it impacts their lives differently today than it did 17 years ago. So they think about it every single day because they've gone on to start their own families. And they're very aware that their children will never meet their Aunt Lacy or their cousin Connor. And that was pretty impactful, at least to me as well.
Well, and the fact that he would have, I was trying to think, okay, how old would the baby be?
Yeah.
I was thinking 14, 15. Again,
oh, man.
And she said he would be 18. And I'm like, whoa.
And then she followed that by saying he'd be 18 and you'd be clear of any child support payments or anything.
Right. So whatever you thought you were going to accomplish, So anyway, it was, I very much wanted to be here today because for me it kind of brings that story full circle.
It does, yeah. Great conversation, great insight. Thank you, Laura, for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you again to ABC7's Laura Anthony. And thank you for listening. If you're enjoying Bay Current, please subscribe on the Odyssey app, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. And you can catch every episode of Bay Current on the KCBS Radio YouTube page. There's a link in the show notes. That's it for today's Bay Current. I'm Matt Pitman. We'll chat with you again tomorrow.